Okay, and here I am again. I'm just gonna merge that in so you can see what some of these homes look like. But this is where they lived. This gives you an idea of where they lived. This is the Bow Hill house. Bow Hill, all the properties of the book looks. I thought that might be I'm a visual person, so sometimes it helps to have an idea of where they lived. But in this particular chapter, it's a little bit longer than the last, so I want to go ahead and get started. She's in her 20s. She has finished up her finishing school, Alice has, and she's given a 200-pound allowance to live off of, and she goes to debutante dances, but anyway, this is where she finds her way in the world. So, for me, the early 20s was a relaxed and carefree time. It was Bow Hill during the winter months. Hunting provided my main occupation and source of exhilaration. I possessed only one horse of my own, but fortunately, my brothers were kind enough to lend me theirs should they have one spare. For 2 seasons, I was lent a lovely thoroughbred by a friend who had to go abroad with his regiment. And so, with the addition of an occasional mount on one of the hunt horses, I did not do too badly and managed 2, if not 3, hunts a week. I thought of little else, which seems strange to me now, but gives me sympathy for those many young people who partake more than ever before in this particular sport. There is, I have found, much one can learn from in that it's helpful in everyday life. It gives you endurance, quickness and perception, speed of decisions. There's a give and take, and infinite patience and tolerance from handling horses, not to mention a bump of locality and a sense of direction that was to be particularly helpful to me at a later date in East Africa. The booklook hunt covered the booklook hunt covered an extensive area, and its followers were apt to come out only when the meat happened to be within reach of where they lived. So there were never the large crowds that often spoil the fun of hunting in the popular Midland counties. I knew everyone by sight and name, and a friendly crowd they were, most of them belonging to families who had farmed, lived, and hunted there for generations. In those days, when army leave was fairly easily obtained, Billy would frequently arrive home for sporting weekends, accompanied by brother officers, and quite often amongst them would be my future husband. Contact with Prince Henry was not confined to these hunting and shooting parties at Bow Hill or at Drumlanrig, because when the regiment was stationed within reach of London, he was also a frequent visitor to Grosvenor's place. He was expected to stay at Buckingham Palace if he was passing the night in London, but this necessitated his saying exactly where he was going and what he was doing. So his use of our house was kept a secret, even from my parents. In fact, only Roland would know the exact arrangements. Billy and Prince Henry used to arrive late in the evening, change, and then go out to their party. They'd return a few hours for sleep and leave by 7 to be on a parade by 8. The family were usually in bed before and after they had come and gone. Cavalry officers from the regiment stationed in Edinburgh would keep their horses in the stables at St. Boswell's and come and hunt at the weekends, often staying with us at Bow Hill. Amongst these were Major and Mrs. T. Had he lived, how proud the Major, later the Colonel, would have been of his grandson, Mark Phillips. Oh, wow. Others included Charles and Elspeth Miller, destined to join us during our stays in Australia as private secretary and lady-in-waiting. Many, alas, failed to return from the war. Notably, Ranulph Twistleton Wykeham Fiennes, grandfather of the explorer, a younger hunt follower whose future one could hardly have foretold, was a small plump boy on an even plumper pony, led on reins by a large mamma on a vast horse. This was Willie Whitelaw. His father had been killed in the First World War, and his widowed mother came to live in the Borders. His grandfather, who lived in Edinburgh, was one of my father's greatest friends. Another enthusiastic member of the hunt was Earl Haig, the field marshal. I often found myself riding with him alongside on the way back to the kennels where my horse was kept. His home at Bemerside was a few miles farther on the same road. He was a delightful and friendly person, and his daughters were our closest friends. When frost made the ground too hard for hunting, we and the young Haigs would organize paper chases through the woods or mixed ice hockey matches. Once we even played the 13 to 18 Hussars at their barracks just outside Edinburgh. The matches were always furious and fast, and on this occasion Doria Haig broke a bone in her ankle. On our return home, Lord Haig was most annoyed and asked why on earth the referee had let things get so loud. We then had to admit that there had not been a referee. This made him even more angry, but in the end, all was forgiven. After Dorothy Haig's wedding to my cousin Andrew Scott, we had a picnic on the road home. It was by Grey Mare's Tail Waterfall in Dumfriesshire. It was a famous, beautiful spot, and afterwards, when we came home screaming down the hill, dressing in our wedding finery, the men all in top hats and tailcoats, a party of sightseers gave one look, rushed in terror for the safety of their charbonnet. Like myself, Xandra, another of the Haig daughters, helped with the Girl Guides, and one summer her troop from Roxburghshire joined with mine from Selkirk at the same camp. Most inconsiderably, she brought her father's camp bed, a very grand iron affair weighing a ton. It would not fit in any tent, so the end had to stick out into the field. It was the only bed we had and could not have been more of a nuisance. The camp itself, however, was a great success. The guides all cried the first night because they were homesick, and again on the last night because they had to go back. By the time I was grown up, cars were fairly commonplace. Most of them were open, with hoods that went up when it was needed. When we grew older, my sister and I were given a Morris Cowley to share between us. Cars had balloon tires at that date. If anything pricked them, they would burst. And one day, as the three of us were merrily spinning along to Edinburgh, that is exactly what happened. I found myself standing in the field of turnips. Mary emerged out of the ditch at the side of the road. But where was Angela? After much agitated searching, we discovered her underneath a bramble bush. She proved to be the only one of us that was hurt. Her collarbone was broken. After a lift home, in a kindly passing car, we left her in a hospital with everything duly taken care of. Mary and I took the plunge and broke the news to my father. He was wrestling with the Times crossword and did not look up while we nervously awaited his reaction. There was a long silence, and he said, "What's a three-letter word for sheep?" he asked. "Ew," we suggested, and that was that. One of my father's greatest sources of pleasures was his caterpillar car. This was a sort of a small tank, open and with the caterpillar tracks instead of wheels. There was virtually nowhere it could not go, and we traveled in it a lot together around the woods and farms. He liked nothing better than to frighten the wits out of unsuspecting guests, taking them for drives up and down the most precipitous banks of the estate. He got the idea of having one of these machines from the Duke of Beaufort, who used one for following the hounds. Okay, caterpillar car. Just curious what these look like. Okay. Is that it? A caterpillar car. So, well, that's kind of interesting. That's a caterpillar car. We were easily and innocently amused by today's standards, acting, and paper games, the various forms of hide and seek, and more energetic favorites like billiard fives and Frida, which entailed tearing around the table at great speed. Practical jokes were also considered extremely funny. They took numerous forms, from simple apple pie beds to more complicated tortures, usually reserved for pompous young men. We would stitch plasters in the seat of their evening trousers and watch them suffer agonies at dinner. It was this sort of behavior that made Prince Henry so much appreciate life with the Scots. He was treated like everyone else. My mother insisted on rolling out the red carpet for him when he arrived, but the rest of us ridiculed this, and I think he found it an embarrassment. No fuss was made of him otherwise, and to me at first he was significant only as one of the more regular visitors among my brother Billy's regimental friends. He was shy, unassuming, and always happy to join the fun. In April 1924, I had my first glimpse of Africa. Sybil had a bad attack of influenza, and her doctors advised her to take a recuperative holiday in the sun. So she decided she would like to visit North Africa. She was married by then, but nothing would induce her husband to accompany her. He was busy with their farm in Wiltshire, and anyway, he hated going abroad. So it was planned that I and a mutual friend of ours, Nellie Bailey Hamilton, would come along instead. Finally, an admirer of Sybil's, a staid and very proper gentleman called Colonel Southey, said he would like to come too. And as he had a large car, we all decided this would be a good idea. The party was completed by a rather ancient lady's maid, who also acted as Nellie's chaperone. With the colonel at the wheel, we set off to tour Algeria. It proved a happy tour with a beautiful scenery and a warm sun, and certainly did the trick as far as Sybil's health was concerned. Nellie was a great character whose spirits and good humor never flagged. She ragged poor Colonel Southey mercilessly, upsetting him by pretending to have fallen madly in love with some undesirable sheik, from whose clutches it seemed that the colonel would imminently have to rescue her. He bore it all very well. For me, a memorable moment in the adventure took place at the oasis town of Biskra. Here there was an old seer who told our fortunes by making marks in the sand. When it came to my turn, took a long while and then said in French that I would marry someone of higher station than myself. Since I was a duke's daughter, this seemed rather unlikely to me. Oh, but she did. But he insisted. I see a crown and much to do with the army. You'll travel greatly and many long distances. I thought, oh, this all sounded like nonsense. Mr. Rowland was now established as head steward of the Booklook household. According to his written account, every day at 7:30 a.m. he would go through the house we happened to be in at the time, seeing that all was in order. Then, after his breakfast at 8:30, he checked all the clocks to see that they were telling the correct time and settled down to his routine cellar or office work. Running the household was still a massive enterprise. Untold tons of logs and 300 or 400 tons of coke and coal were alone used every year in fueling it. Christmas at Bowhill continued to be as much of a feast as it was at Dalkeith. The festivities The festivities lasted a month, with an average of 80 mouths to feed at every meal. One year, no fewer than 220 people were given Christmas dinner. The standard order was for 150 pounds of turkey. The business of moving to one house to another was miraculously completed in a matter of 2 days. This included the transport of 250 pieces of luggage, collectively weighing no less than 8 tons. Delivering food from the kitchen to the dining room along the endless passages at Dunlanrig required a split-second timing in souffles, and were not to fall flat, or the weekly haunch of roasted venison would arrive stone cold. Once an odd man took a wrong turn and got lost in the house, and the second course for the dinner. Even guests would go astray, especially after the port and cigars. To prevent this was still a red line painted along the passage wall to indicate the route between the smoking or the billiard room in a remote wing of the castle and the main building. It was considered bad form to smoke when the ladies of the house might be around. So the gentlemen were given this special room well outside the smelling distance. Okay, this is Dunland Rig. I'm going to show you how big it looks. That's how big it looks. I mean, it was huge. So, The cellars at Bowhill and Dunlamrig each contained 54-gallon barrels of whiskey, the equivalent of 100 dozen bottles, which were never allowed to be more than half empty, and there were similar supplies of sherry and port. All of this and much more was the responsibility of the steward. It's easy to see why the stock response to every problem was, "I'll ask Mr. Rowland." This watchword was used to ultimate effect one morning when my father asked a footman if it was raining. "I'll ask Mr. Rowland, your grace," came the reply. My father summoned Rowland. "Has the footman any brains at all?" he said. "If he had any more, he would not be here," answered Rowland. My father frequently closeted himself with Rowland after the dinner to discuss family matters and current events quite as much as the problems of the household. Sometimes they talked till the early morning of the hours, my father pacing up and down as if he was back on the deck of a ship. Rowland was no less a confidant of ours. It was not done to have drinks before dinner in the way that it is now. At least my father would not allow it. So Rowland used to supply my brothers and their friends with a tipple in the steward's room at 6:30. Only my mother noticed. "Why, I wonder, does Billy always have to see Rowland every evening?" she puzzled. But of course, his secret was secure. In 1926, I went again to Africa, but this time to the Cape. The Earl of Athlone was Governor General of South Africa at that time, and my elder sister, Meta, was lady in waiting to Princess Alice. When she got engaged to Commander Geoffrey Hawkins, ADC to the Governor General, it was decided that it was more convenient to hold a wedding out there. My mother and I were invited to stay at the government house. The ceremony took place at the newly built cathedral, Cape Town. My mother's brother, Colonel Harry Bridgman, came down from his farm in the Transvaal to give my sister away. I accepted with delight and an invitation to stay on for a while, which enabled me to see more of South Africa under very enjoyable circumstances. South Africa in those days offered no hint of future disharmony. It seemed the most blissfully happy place. One never saw a glum face. The Athlones were more than kind and took me around with them on various tours, and as a result, I got quite a broad picture in the relatively short time I was there, as well as a chance to develop a very sincere devotion to my host and hostess. Perhaps the most memorable expedition in which I took part in was a shooting safari in Zululand. This took place during an Easter holiday for the staff. The party consisted of two ADCs, Mida, my brother-in-law, and myself. We took no tents, and our entire equipment was put on a wagon and drawn by 12 donkeys. One morning at the crack of dawn, the others all went off to shoot a rhino. Princess Alice had allowed me to go only on the condition that I did not take part in the shooting of this particularly dangerous animal. So, honoring my promise to her, I stayed and tidied up the camp with the Africans. Suddenly, there was not a soul to be seen. The Africans were all huddled under the wagon. Glancing around, I saw a mother rhino and her baby trotting down towards us. I hid under one of the camp beds, praying she would not scent me, and to my great relief, she passed by. The hunters later returned, exhausted and empty-handed, having not seen a rhino all day. Afterwards, I wish I had been bolder and taken a photograph. On another occasion, Sir Richard and Lady Howard Vyse, Sir Richard nicknamed the Wombat because of his resemblance to that animal, arrived at Government House in the course of their honeymoon. Isn't that interesting? Wasn't that Prince William's nickname by Diana Wombat. Unwisely, they mentioned that their next stop was Victoria Falls. "Oh, Alice hasn't seen Victoria Falls," said Princess Alice forcefully. "You'd better take her along with you." The last thing they can have wanted was company, but they obligingly agreed, and off I went. With Mita's enormously fat maid to look after me, needless to say, they would not have been more welcome and indeed protective when they went to see me safely on to the sleeper for Natal to visit my Uncle Harry Bridgman. Hermione Weiss was put out to find that my maid had been consigned to a different part of the train. "Who's next door to Lady Alice Scott?" she demanded. It turned out to be Ivor Guest, later Lord Winbourne, a young man who I knew vaguely from England. Hermione confronted him immediately. "You can't possibly be next to Alice Scott," she explained briskly. "You must move into another carriage. Her maid has got to go in there." The disgruntled young man was put to flight. We subsequently met on many occasions, and I am glad to say he bore me no malice. South Africa was idyllic, but its legacy turned out to be a frightening bout of cerebral malaria. One morning I woke up with a mosquito bite on my elbow. Apparently, the train I was on had stopped overnight in a cerebral malaria district, but not knowing this at the time, I thought no more of it until crossing the equator on the homeward voyage. I developed a fever and soon fell unconscious. It was a horrid experience. In delirium, I thought I was a tree in a tin. All my limbs were growing, and I could not let them out, so that the more they grew and the more they ached. Luckily, the greatest living authority on tropical diseases, Dr. Rabligate, happened to be on board, and one of the passengers had some dope that pulled me through, but I was lucky not to die. I convalesced at Boughton. Nothing could have been more tonic. After dinner, we and our guests would go out into the woods to hear the singing of the nightingales. It usually ended, at least for the younger members of the house party, with a rough and tumble in the bushes. Another pastime I especially associated with Boughton, though we played it as fervently as other house parties, is treasure hunting. This involved going off in pairs after dinner, a boy and a girl, with a list of about 20 items that had to be collected as soon as possible from the surrounding countryside. Whoever arrived home with their full consignment were declared the winners. Inevitably, there were silly things to be fetched, like Mrs. Corrigan's stays or ones that involved daredevil burglaries on neighboring country houses, perhaps obliging the hunters to motor 20 miles or more. It was great fun for us, but most of the times having been very irritating for other people. It was a great age for after dinner games, and we often would settle down to charades and some sort of paper game like Consequences. At the time, I remember some of the responses people invented seemed very daring, but I'm afraid the young today would think of them very boring and innocent. Our most intriguing neighbor was probably Mr. Brudnell of Dean, who wore a square top hat and a long cloth cloak even indoors to keep out the drought. I first met him when I was about 14. My mother had announced, "We must have the new owner of Dean Park over for lunch. I believe he's stone deaf, so we'll have to shout." On the appointed day, my mother's duly shouted at Mr. Brudnell throughout half the meal, and then, turning to Mita, said, "Your turn now." Mita took over the shouting, and after lunch we all shouted goodbye to him. A few weeks later, at a flower show, I was again introduced to Mr. Brudnell. "Ah, yes," he said, "you and your sisters made rude remarks about me all throughout lunch. You know I can lip read," he told them. Another time at Boughton, my father had a professor of forestry over from Cambridge for lunch. Afterwards, they toured the woods with the retired head forester. His name was Mr. Neal. When the tour was over, my father turned to Mr. Neal and said, "Well, have you learned anything from the professor?" "Not a damn bit. It was all a lot of rot." The embarrassed professor then left. Neal said to my father, "You should not have said that to the professor. I agree with you." A delightful friend of both my father and mother was Lady Mabel Howard. She often came to stay and regaled us with amusing stories. She drove herself, most dangerously and usually on the wrong side of the road, in an aged Morris Oxford. The car was named the Humble One, and it was a well known wherever she went, most people stopped and going as far as the road as possible when she saw it coming. My sister and I quite often stayed with her at Greystoke Castle. We always enjoyed it there, in spite of it being haunted and creepy at night. With no electric lights and a badly fitting windows and doors creaking and banging, she lived on her own but asked endless guests of all ages who were welcome to come any time. She'd always arrange amusing expeditions for us, and it was nevertheless then the greatest fun to be with her. We all loved her very dearly, as did many in the county of Cumberland and the town of Carlisle, where she did endless good work for the benefit of the needy. Her sister, Lady Nina Balfour, another particular favorite of my father's, was one of our neighbors, presiding at Newtondon in the Borders. She was also a great character and an incorrigible matchmaker, which was rather off-putting. But there was no hostess in Scotland who could equal the deliciousness of our food. Her impeccable taste and flair for a party. She also had a rollicking sense of humor. One of her favorite jokes against herself concerned one of the many balls of Newton Dunn, an elderly waiter who had been engaged to the formal announcement of the guests. He was not very experienced at the job, and shortly after the start of the presentations, he was flummoxed by the arrival of two horse-drawn buses from which large numbers of people descended. He correctly gauged that this was the Duke of Roxburgh and his party, but despairing of their numbers, proceeded to announce them collectively as the party from the floors. Then, met by a wave of arrivals from the second bus, he bellowed, "And some more of them!" Aunt Celia, the Countess of Scarborough, was another of my father's favorites. She's not always popular, because she would insist on attending the grouse shoots carrying a yellow umbrella. If it started to rain in the middle of a drive, as it usually seemed to be, up went the umbrella and all the grouse flew right into the next county. I think my father rather encouraged her because it made all his relations, who took shooting a great deal more seriously than he did, besides themselves, with rage. My mother was not interested in shooting, but she was subtle in showing her disapproval. She just pretended she could not tell the difference between one bird or another. It was a fiction she kept up until the end of her life. My brother William and his wife Rachel were once staying at Bransholme, the home of her old age, and Rachel remembered her saying to the cook, "Lord William will have a cold wing of snipe for breakfast." A snipe is, of course, about the size of a sparrow. An aunt who made a great impression on me was my mother's younger sister, Helena, Lady Sefton. The other Bridgman aunts and my mother tended to the rather prim, but Aunt Nellie could not have been more forthright or spirited. Long before the First War, she shocked her relations by wearing trousers and going off on a big game shooting with a boyfriend. Needless to say, it was the trousers that caused the worst scandal. In the last war, she drove lorries, though by then she was well over 70. She was terrifically given to a good works and a very religious person. I was very impressed when she once took me down the canteen in the docks where she often helped cook breakfast for the merchant seamen who had come in the night before or ate breakfast at dawn. Possessed as I was of a strong sense that I ought to be doing something to help others, I went one night a week to help the captain of the Selkirk Guides and Rangers, and also joined the Selkirk branch of the Red Cross, eventually becoming a VAD. My mother disapproved of this, thinking it wrong and dangerous that I would drive myself to and from Selkirk, 4 miles distance. Alone and after dark through the winter months, she would probably have been even more disapproving if she'd known that on the way home I invariably gave a lift to old Tom, the odd man, who regularly walked to the town in all weathers for a drink at the pub. For the Red Cross camp one year I ventured on my own as far as Dunnock in Aberdeenshire. The camp was for the whole of Scotland. The camp was for the whole of Scotland, and I got to know many extremely nice people who I was later came across again in the war at first aid posts, hospital supply depots, or engaged in various other useful capacities. Taking on a particularly hazardous stretch of road known as Devil's Elbow in a Morris Oxford was an alarming experience. The engine boiling like a kettle before I was halfway up the mountain. Skiing at St. Moritz in January in 1927 and 1929 provide some of my happiest memories. However, very different St. Moritz was in those days was to the crowded resort that it has become today. The people who did go were mostly English and Americans. I went out with the Haddingtons, Zandra Haig, and Sarah Haddington's sister, Dorothy. Being Canadian, Sarah and Dorothy were both expert skiers and skaters. We joined many friends and acquaintances at the Subtra Hotel, at that time run by Englishman Colonel Bond, who appeared to be a tremendous friend for everybody. It was like staying in a private house party. Those one did those one did not know already, one soon became friendly with, through meeting over a sundowner or joining up for dinner all together. There were no ski lifts. It was quite an effort struggling up the slopes to the start of the runs. Luckily, as a result of much of the riding, I was very fit and had the necessary muscles for controlling my skis. It did not take me long or get going easily without too many tumbles. Sometimes amongst the breathless climbers, one would find Lady Astor with her sister Mrs. Brand alongside. They were expert skiers and enjoyed the fun as much as anyone, in spite of being elderly compared to most of us. Nancy Astor, through her fame and force of character, tended to preside over the party. She was a lot of fun, but she could sometimes be rather cruel and sarcastic, as when she deliberately embarrassed people in public. During a lull at dinner, for instance, she might suddenly fasten on some shy young girl and shout across the table, "Who is that young man I saw you having chocolate with?" The victim, not surprisingly, was apt to be mortified by the unexpected attention which was focused on her. Occasionally, we would go skiing by moonlight. This entailed riding in a snowcat vehicle with caterpillar wheels, which took us to the start of the long run down a wide track through the forest. It was most romantic, with the full moon casting blue shadows from the snow covered fir trees on either side. At the end of the run, we assembled for hot soup at a small chalet, and from there drove back to the hotel. Sometimes we would go to Sils Maria, a small resort on the border with Italy. For this, we hired a horse drawn sleigh with three or four of us sitting inside and two following on skis holding on to a rope. But with tinkling bells attached to the horses and beautiful scenery all around us, this was a charming experience. We had friends practicing for the Cresta run and sometimes went to watch them. Alexandra and I persuaded them to arrange for us to go down the last lap one Sunday morning when the run was close to competition. I'm sure this must have been most irresponsible on their part. However, as it snowed heavily the night before, the jaunt was not possible, just as well. There were particular skating competitions on the lake, and most nights a party of some sort. One particular memorable one was given by Mary Ashley to announce her engagement to Bobby Cunningham Reed. There must have been 30 or more of us seated around a large round table, and a very hilarious party it was. On another evening, there was a fancy dress ball. I went as Jackie Coogan, and by borrowing the right sort of cap, I made a passable impression. They were very happy days, and overall too soon, 3 weeks seeming to be the prescribed length of a visit. In 1929, it represented something of a watershed of my life. Apart from anything else, it was the year my father first showed symptoms of cancer, undiagnosed at the time, from which he eventually would die. It was not an easy period. My mother was devoted to my father and terribly worried about his health, but her anxiety and fuss irritated him. Things were not improved by the arrival of a permanent nurse in the form of Miss Dickey. He enjoyed her company and showed his gratitude by giving her a pearl necklace and a fur coat. Oh boy. Not unnaturally, this made my mother jealous. I thought was also slightly jealous of me because I, too, at the time, was favored by my father. As a result, I felt uneasy at home and restless in other ways. Then the unfulfilled promise I had made in return for my life, it nagged me, and it nagged at my conscience. Boyfriends were getting overly friendly, and increasingly I did not know how to cope. I began to realize that the people I met were birds of a feather. Young men in particular, that is, who seemed to think of nothing but hunting, shooting, fishing, and point to points. I wanted to find a different kind of life, to meet other types of people. It was at this time that my Uncle Francis Scott, his wife, and his two lovely little girls arrived at Dunlandrig on holiday from their farm in Kenya. They suggested I come and stay with them for an extended visit, and they assured me that there were plenty of things I could do to make myself useful. Coming in a moment of such uncertainty, the offer could not have been more tempting, but nevertheless, I found it hard to accept. There was my hunting to give up, and the sadness of leaving my father. Uncle Francis and his family left. I remained in doubt. Then one day, when I was out for a walk, turning the question over in my mind for the umpteenth time, a roe deer suddenly started up in a it leapt a fence and galloped away toward the hills. There, I thought, that's an omen. I must get up and gallop away too. And with no further ado, I went home and I wrote a letter of acceptance. And there she is. She's off to Kenya, her first trip to Kenya by herself. So, and that is the end of chapter 6.